Hello, my name is Mark. Welcome to Quilter's Architect. In today's video, I want to introduce a new pattern I've been working on. It's called Delightful Dahlias. And I'm pretty sure that if my mom were still here, she would definitely approve of this quilt pattern. She had a lot of flowers around her house. So while I was working on this quilt pattern, I definitely thought of her some. And if you look at this quilt pattern, it has 7 different fabrics included, and there are 12 dahlias. You could go at this from different directions. I have the 7 different fabrics. You could just use from yardage to select fabrics for the quilt. And another option is, given that there are 12 of these Delightful Dahlia blocks, you could also take a fat quarter for each of the flowers and use that fat quarter to cut out the piecing for the flowers themselves, the flower petals. But then another option you could do is go scrappy. And that's what I'm going to do. Looking at these flowers, we have 4 petals that are using 4.5-inch squares and 4 other petals that are using 4.5 by 6-inch rectangles. So here's a tub of scraps that we have on hand, and I have some around 10-inch squares here, a stack of those. And so what I was thinking is for the 4.5 by 6.5-inch rectangle pieces that go for 4 of the petals on each of the dahlia flower blocks, I'm going to select from these, and I'm probably going to mix them up in color families. And then for the other 4.5-inch squares, I have these stacks of 5-inch scrap squares. And so another thing that I wanted to do is just go through and do a little grouping by color family, and then I'll cut out my 4.5-inch squares and 4.5 by 6.5-inch rectangles from the combination of these 10-inch square scraps and these 5-inch square scraps. And then for the rest of the quilt, what I plan to do is I have this other fabric laid out here that I'll show you. So in the middle of each of the dahlia blocks, there's a yellow color in the pattern. In our scraps, we had this fabric, which looks like it would work nicely for the center of a flower, as well as these other ones here. I'll show you those. Here's our scraps. Here's another one. And then lastly, I thought I would use this. So I'll mix those up as well amongst the 12 dahlia flower blocks. And then the other thing is, around the yellow in the pattern, you can see what looks like a flying geese around the outside edge of that square. But actually what I'm doing is stitch and flips in this pattern. Both the 4.5-inch petal squares and the 4.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle petals are using stitch and flips. On the rectangle piece, it's going to have 2 stitch and flips from a black fabric in the pattern. And so I have this fabric here to use for that. And then on the opposing end, for the background of the quilt, I have white on white designated in the quilt, but you can see this fabric that I have for that purpose. And so for those rectangles, it'll have stitch and flips from both the black and the white fabric. And then on the 4.5-inch squares, those flower petals will just have 2 stitch and flips, and those will come from this white fabric. And then the other thing is, you'll notice that in the sashing of this quilt, I have this, it's kind of like a green color in the pattern. I think I called it Evergreen is the color name we gave it, as Sherry and I were working on this pattern together. And looking at this fabric, you can see we have something that'll work nicely. This is kind of in those squares in the sashing, and then also this fabric will be used for stitch and flips around the outside corners of the dahlia blocks. Going along with that, we need our sashing fabric, right? And so this fabric I plan to use for the sashing as well as the inner border, and that'll give a nice consistent color all around the quilt on that inner border. And then lastly, for fabric, we have the outer border, and this is kind of similar to what I included in the pattern. You can see this fabric, and so all of this looks like it'll coordinate very well together. You see the outer and inner border for the shoe fly and the block that'll end up, that shoe fly secondary block will end up being created as a result of the outer stitch and flips along with the blocks inside of the sashing. So that all looks like it'll coordinate very well. And then of course, the rest of the petals on my dahlia blocks will be scrappy. And so I plan to group those together again in color groupings and have kind of like 12 variations on the dahlia block itself. Let's take a quick look at the fabric requirements for this quilt. And looking at page 2, we see that for that evergreen fabric, we need a 1/4 yard. For the white on white, which is our background of our quilt, we need 1 5/8 yards. For the lemon is what I'm calling it in the quilt pattern, or the center of our dahlia flower blocks, we only need a 1/4 yard of that. And then for the midnight or black fabric, we need a 1/2 yard. And then I'm calling the fabric in the pattern for the flower petals raspberry, and we need 1 1/2 yards of that. Then there's Caribbean, which is our lighter color for our sashing strips and inner border, as well as the Pacific for our outer border. For the Caribbean, we need 1 1/8 yard, and for the Pacific, we need 7/8 yards. So hopefully you have some yardage available, or you have some fat quarters you'd like to use, or some scraps that you'd like to use in this beautiful quilt pattern, Delightful Dahlias. Looking at this quilt pattern, I think that if you did decide to go with a single fabric selection for the flower petals on the dahlia blocks, it'd still be a beautiful quilt. But I'm kind of thinking that this scrappy collection that I have here is a lot of flower prints. That's going to actually, I think, contribute to the quilt looking really nice, because if we have a lot of these flower prints inside of the flower petals in the different color groupings that we choose, it's kind of going to add to the whole idea of a quilt that's made of dahlias, right? Even though I don't have necessarily dahlias, flower prints, and all of this scrap, right? But I thought that'd make a really nice looking Delightful Dahlia block to use a combination of flower prints from the scraps. So it should be really interesting to see how this quilt comes together. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to do some cutting, a little bit of grouping of the fabrics, obviously, because I have more 5-inch squares than I need. If you look at the cutting instructions, I actually need, for the raspberry fabric on page 3, we have our cutting instructions. I need 48 of the 4.5 squares and 48 of the 4.5 by 6-inch rectangles. So obviously, looking at my collection of scraps here in the tub, I have more than that. So I'll go through and I'll pull out some groupings of fabrics, because I'll have to cut all the piecing for the petals out of these scraps. And then also we have the other fabric we need to cut. If you look at the evergreen fabric, this fabric is what I'm using. You need 54 2.5-inch squares. And then for the white on white, and here's that fabric again, I have multiple pieces for that. I have 48 2.5 by 6.5-inch rectangles, 48 2.5 by 4.5-inch rectangles, and then I also need 96 2.5-inch squares and 96 2.25-inch squares. Then for this lemon, that's fairly straightforward. It's just those squares in the center of each of the dahlia blocks in the flowers. Those are 4.5-inch squares. We need 12 of those. And then for the midnight fabric, because we're using this for the stitch and flips, we need 96 2.5-inch squares. Then for our Caribbean fabric, we're going to be cutting a lot of strips because we're using this in our sashing in our inner border. So we have 17 2.5 by 16.5-inch strips. We have 2 2.5 by 70.5-inch strips. And then we have 2 2.5 by 56.5-inch strips. And of course, those longer ones are for our borders, and we'll be joining multiple width of fabric 2.5-inch strips to create those border pieces. And then lastly, we have this Pacific fabric, and this we're going to be cutting 2 74.5-inch strips and 2 64.5-inch by 4.5-inch strips. And again, the same thing, we'll cut with the fabric from this, we'll join those together, and then we'll cut out our border pieces from those pieces that we've joined together. And you'll notice also on page 3, I have just a few brief notes here. I'm assuming a 1/4-inch seam allowance throughout in the pattern. You can press the seams as desired. And then for width of fabric, if you're going with yardage from width of fabric, I'm expecting that you would have around 42 inches of usable fabric. Sherry has definitely been adding to the scraps recently, and she said there's some different fabrics. I had used from some of these before in the past, but she said there are definitely some other fabrics that she's added to these. And so that's the first thing I'm going to do. I'm going to just start going through these, try to group some like color families together so that I can then decide which ones to use to cut out my 48 4.5-inch squares and 48 4.5 by 6.5-inch rectangles from these. And of course, since some of this fabric was folded up, I'll have to do a little pressing here. So I'll get to that. Now that I have all the pressing done, I won't have you watch me cut fabric, but I will show you all the pieces that I've cut out. You might choose to go with a single fabric. For this fabric I labeled as raspberry. In my case, I'm using scrappy. I decided to just cut these as I make each block, and so here I'll show you my first color selection in the pink category. So if we look at the pattern instructions on page 4, the first step is to make the middle petal units, and we need fabric pieces D, H, and G to do this. You also may want to refer to the appendix SF1 for detailed instructions on stitch and flip, but I imagine most of you are very experienced at making those. The first thing we want to do is mark a diagonal line from corner to corner on the wrong side of our smaller squares for our flip and stitch. Since we have 2 flip and stitches on each end of this rectangle, I thought it'd be easier to do the opposing corners. And as that appendix document explains, we'll just sew directly on this line from corner to corner. And I'm just turning this around and doing the same on the opposing corner. Next, I'll just cut off the fabric a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the outside towards the corner. And of course, we'll press our stitch and flip towards the outside. And now just complete the stitch and flip for the other 2 corners. And here I'll just join the other 2 corners to the unit. I'll cut off the fabric again on the outside corner, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And once we press these 2 corners of our stitch and flips, we'll have this unit completed. For each of our blocks, we're going to need 4 of these units. But if you were doing the same fabric throughout the quilt, then you might choose to make all 48 units at once. And here are all 4 of the middle petal units completed. And here on page 4, the next step is to make the corner petal units. And here we'll be needing fabric pieces I and E. Similar to the other stitch and flip, we'll be doing the same thing, joining this smaller square, sewing directly on the line. Kind of having a little doubt here that even though I'm doing both corners, it might have been better to have just done one from a pressing perspective, because this is a small square, right? It's 4.5 inches square, the larger piece of fabric. And of course, we'll cut off to the outside corner, leaving our 1/4 inch seam allowance. And of course, we'll press these stitch and flips. Again, this is a little tight. The iron will not really fit between these, so it would have been better to have just joined one corner, pressed it, and then turned them around to do the other corner. And here I have all 4 of the first part of the corner petal unit completed. Now we need to move on to the second part of that. And here on page 5, this is the continuation of the instructions for making the corner petal units. Now we'll be joining those fabric pieces B and C, as well as then doing lastly that stitch and flip on the outside corner. So here I have the first part of the corner unit I made along with the two rectangles, and then of course we will use this small square as well for the outside stitch and flip. So I'll join that first rectangle to the first part of the corner unit that we've already made. And then of course I need to press that seam. And now of course I'll join the other rectangle to the unit. And now we can press this seam, and then we'll be ready for the stitch and flip on the corner. Now just join this small square to the unit to complete this corner unit. And we'll cut off our excess fabric beyond our seam allowance. Once we have this pressed, we'll have our corner petal unit completed. And of course, if you have any dog ears along the edge, you can trim those off with your ruler. I went ahead and completed the other 3 corner petal units. And here you can see I have all the pieces or all the units that make up the block laid out together. At this point, you can refer to page 8 for instructions for making the block itself. I decided to join these in rows. So I have 3 rows of the overall block ready to go. I haven't pressed it yet, but here's the block with all those rows joined together. This is really looking nice. And now that I have the block starched and pressed, I'm going to take the ruler and put it corner to corner to try to even up the edge and cut off any ravelings. And here's the finished block. I think this first one in the pink grouping of scraps turned out really nice. Okay, well I've completed one block, and now that I've demonstrated fully how to make that block, I'm going to move on and just show you in rapid succession the fabric selections made for each of the other blocks, as well as the completed block. Here's some scrappy selections from the teal color family, and here's the completed block. Here's some scrappy selections from the orange color family, and here's the completed block. Here's some scrappy selections from the purple color family, and here's the completed block. Here are some scrappy selections from the yellow color family, and here's the completed block. Here's another scrappy selection from the purple color family, and here's the completed block. Here's some scrappy selections from the dark green color family, and here's the completed block. Here's some more scrappy selections from the pink color family, and here's the completed block. Here are some scrappy selections from the blue color family, and here's the completed block. Here's another scrappy selection from the orange color family, and here's the finished block. Here's another scrappy selection from the teal color family, and here's the completed block. Here's the last one, a scrappy selection from the pink color family, and the finished block. Well, next I need to move on to assembling these blocks into rows and making the quilt right, but how to arrange them is the next question. So now I'm going to try to lay them, organize them on the floor to see what looks good together. I think I like this arrangement. I'm going to label them A1 to 3, B1 to 3, and so on in rows. Okay, after further thought, maybe a little bit more of an adjustment here. And of course I need blue to give his approval. Page 9 from the pattern illustrates how to assemble the first 3 rows as units with the sashing and sashing blocks. And then on page 10 we see the difference for the last row. It doesn't have the horizontal part of the sashing right because it's the last row. For these first 3 rows I plan to go at it like this, forming a horizontal sashing along with a vertical sashing and a sashing block to create kind of a square unit. So here on the floor I laid out what that looks like with 3 of the blocks and the sashing and sashing blocks. And here's what I meant by assembling that first block, a horizontal and vertical, and a sashing block together as a unit. And here are the first 3 units for the first row, ready to go together. And here's that first row all joined together as a unit. And here's row 2 all joined together. And here's row 3 all joined together. And here's row 4 all joined together, and you can see the difference how this unit doesn't have the horizontal sashing or sashing blocks. Page 11 from the pattern illustrates assembling the top half of the inner quilt. Well, I didn't lay them on the floor very straight, but here are rows 1 and 2 ready to join together. And here are rows 1 and 2 joined together, forming the top half of the inner quilt. Page 12 illustrates assembling the bottom half of the inner quilt. And here are rows 3 and 4 joined together, forming the bottom half of the inner quilt. And page 13 illustrates assembling the top and bottom halves of the quilt to form the entire inner quilt. And here is the full inner quilt all joined together. This is really looking awesome. Page 14 explains how to assemble the inner border to the quilt. Since this border seam is such a long seam, I'm going to pin it at both ends, then pin it in the middle, and then I'm also going to put another pin between the center and each end. And this is just to make sure that our border stays evenly distributed with the quilt as we join it to the quilt. Okay, time to move on to joining these side inner borders to the quilt. And of course we'll need to press our seams. And here's the inner quilt with the side inner borders joined on. Need to just add the top and bottom. And here it is with the entire inner border joined to the quilt. Page 15 from the pattern illustrates the outer border assembly. And I'm doing the same thing with the outer border. I'm going to do the pinning again. I just find this helps me avoid issues with the length of the border being cut to fit the quilt and not running into issues once you get to the other end when you're joining the border to the quilt. Okay, time to join this outer border to the quilt. It's getting exciting, getting close to having the quilt top completed. And of course we'll press our seams. Wow, I really like both those borders around all of those Delightful Dahlia blocks. I like the way it turned out. A little later I'll get a better picture. It's really hard to get a good picture on the floor because it's hard to hold your camera high enough up not to have it a little distorted. Here's the selected quilting pattern for the long arm, and this one's named Diana. Here I just wanted to show you a little bit of the long arming in progress. And here's a still shot giving a close-up look at this quilting pattern. Here you can see my binding, which is ready to go, and I think this fabric's going to nicely complement some of the scrappy fabric in my flowers. Time to get started joining this binding to the back of the quilt. Okay, time to move on with the front side of the quilt and the binding. Getting close to having this quilt done. Normally we take our quilts out to the pole barn on the right with that barn quilt over the door and take a real nice picture in the sunshine of the finished quilt. But you can see that the beginning of the large winter storm is here, so I'm not going to be able to do that today. I don't have any ladders in the house either, so the best thing I can do is lay the quilt over the long arm, and here's a shot of it from there. For the backing, we didn't quite have enough of this fabric you see on each side to match it entirely, and so we decided to take another fabric and run a strip right up and down the middle all the way down the quilt. But this matches very nice to the front of the quilt, I think. Well, I hope you enjoyed joining me as I made the Delightful Dahlias quilt pattern, and also I hope that you have some 5-inch or 10-inch scraps that you can use, and if not, you can always go with yardage to make this beautiful quilt. If you enjoy videos like this and you haven't subscribed to my channel, I encourage you to do so. Also, please leave your comments about how you think the quilt turned out, and if you enjoyed the video, please give me a thumbs up. Until the next video, I'm wishing you happy quilting and beautiful finishes.